I'm Jack Weiss. I'm president of Design Evanston. Just in case you don't know what Design Evanston is, it's a 501c3, not-for-profit design advocacy organization. So we advocate for good design in Evanston. New construction, preservation, restoration, public works, private works. We periodically have annual Design Evanston Awards, where we give the awards not to the architects, but to the owners of the properties who have invested money in good design. We have a website called designevanston.org. We have a number of events roughly 6 events a year. Most of them the public can come to. Members are usually free and non-members are usually $5. I'll announce it right now if you're interested. We're going to be doing a tour of the new Walgreens on, I think it's Wednesday, October 26th. 5th? September 25th, Wednesday, September 25th. It'll be a presentation by the folks from Walgreens, and then we'll actually do a hard hat tour of the building.
And this is a net zero building. It's the first net zero Walgreens to be built in the whole country.
And where is it?
It's on Chicago Avenue north of Keeney.
Does everybody understand what net zero means?
They're generating their own power
All the energy it consumes.
with geothermal into the ground, with windmill, what are they called? They're called wind turbines, and solar panels. All of the above. And it is, there was an article in the Tribune, in the New York Times last week about our Walgreens. So not to delay any further, I have a unannounced thing I want to do first. As a way of thanking my committee members for working their hearts out on this project, I have a gift for them. And if any of you can identify what this gift is, I might have one for you too.
Oh, it's from the Purple Hotel. I think you're lucky, right? Cool. I love it, Jack. Thank you, Jack. Look at how cool that is.
They're all excited about it. What is it? What was it? Well, it's about to be what was it, because it's coming down the Purple Hyatt in Lincolnwood. John Maxey, Evanston's own John Maxey, designed the building. You've probably heard the interviews with him, with his daughter. There was a Channel 11 interview with him recently about it. I was driving by yesterday. The construction fence was open. There was no one there. And I went in with my car and stole a bunch of the corner bricks. So there are a lot of these, actually. Well, this one's broken up. A lot of corners where the balconies came out and turned and went back. A lot of corners, and so this has 2 pieces of purple on it. And I think the deconstruction started today. And also, John isn't here, but he was disappointed that we didn't include his buildings in our book. But we are honoring him by bringing home a piece of his building to our own homes. So, okay. I have to push my own button here.
You want me to do that for you, Jack?
No, I can do it. Okay. Are any of you into Excel spreadsheets? Oh, I have so much fun with Excel spreadsheets. I want to tell you a little bit about the process, and then I'll introduce you to the team first. Stuart Cohn, Laura Saviano, Heidi Hoppe, and Chris Hartzell. Stuart's an architect. Laura is a marketing director for an architectural firm. Heidi is an architect, and Chris is an architectural historian. And I am a graphic designer and president of this esteemed organization. About the process, and then we'll each talk about our favorite parts of the book. If you want to write or publish a book, be prepared to spend lots of time. I have now over 600 hours of time on this project as the manager. I'm calling myself the COO. I designed the book. I'm one of the 5 authors. I photographed a lot of the places. And I'm currently, my main job now is book fulfillment. I process the orders that are coming in on PayPal and everywhere else on our website. Take them to the post office and mail them. Each of these folks here, where'd Heidi go? Each of the authors has spent at least 100 hours. I don't know if they kept track of their hours, but it's at least 100 hours minimum. We each selected 30 places that we each wrote about. So 30 times 5 is 150. Okay. During the process, 2-year process, I received over 2,200 emails, not counting the ones that I trashed. Then beyond all that stuff that you have to do to bring a book to fruition, you have to find sponsors to underwrite the project. And we were fortunate in getting initially First Bank and Optima, David Hovey, to give us major funding for the first book. And now we're just going to press with our second edition already after only 2 months. The Driehaus Foundation has given us a major grant. And, oh God help me. Oh, and Evanston Community Foundation has given us a grant. So we're very pleased that we've had that kind of support. The book has been selling very, very well. You're seeing the last of the first edition here. We'll be getting, we have the proofs for the second edition, and we'll be getting new books, hardbounds and softbounds, by the middle of September. Okay, so this project took 2 years. It took a year to receive nominations. We sent out a request for nominations across the city. We got nominations from lots of people, including some aldermen, and other Design Evanston members and us. But it took over a year to clear all those nominations, add more, take some away, negotiate, and end up with 150. At the very end, we were actually taking some out and putting new ones in because we were trying to get some balance. And then we spent the next year researching and writing, photographing, and editing the book. So it took two full years. Let's see. Heidi's introduction says it best. We carefully selected projects by date, building type, architect, and location. We paid special attention to groupings of structures and modest homes. We tried to be gender neutral, unconventionally naming homes only by last name, not by the husband's name, which is a conventional way of naming places. And we included Marion Mahoney Griffin's chapel on Chicago Avenue by, is it Second Press? Yeah, Second Press's parking lot is where her only built building ever stood. Marion Mahoney Griffin was the world's first licensed female architect. And her only project ever built was here in Evanston. So we wanted to make... All Souls Chapel, I think, and it's in the book. It's in the book. It's a beautiful, well, actually, no, we don't talk about it in our presentation, but it's in the book. Church of All Souls. In addition to the places, we have a number of other interesting pieces in the book. Among them are the index by place name, by street name, and by architect name. So you can search the 150 by any number of ways through the index. And then we have four maps in the back of the book where we divided the city into quadrants, and you can see where these projects are in relation to the 4 quadrants of the city. So you can actually take the book. If we do an e-book, you can actually take your personal device with you and walk around with these quadrants and find these houses and places. Okay, so this is the end of the 1-year process where we were selecting the 150 nominations. This is organized by year. So we were looking at all of these columns at various times to try to find a balance. I think the year thing was probably fairly critical to make sure we had every decade of the 150 years covered. Some decades were full of places. Others were fairly modest in the 30s, 20s. I forget what was the lean year, but there were some lean years. There were some big years. As you know, a lot of the landmark houses in Evanston were built in the 1880s, 1890s. So You'll see a lot of those there from 1881 all the way through 1899, a whole bunch there. And those are in the book. This is the final selection of places in the book. But we also were able to sort for architect names and make sure we had a good representation of architects. We were able to sort for building types, so we have multifamily, single family, commercial, industrial, institutional types of buildings to make sure we had a balance of those. We also, well, single family. Double houses were of great interest to us. There are a lot of double houses in Evanston. Address, very interesting. So we got this thing pretty far along. I intentionally did address by number and address by street name. So we could sort for address by number, and all the low numbers would come up at the top of the list. Those are numbers that would be south and east in Evanston. And the higher numbers would be north and west. So we were able to see how our selections were playing out in terms of the cross-section of the city. We, as we said, we want to try to be very democratic. We want to be very inclusive of all building types. So some of us had a particular bent for smaller houses, and some of us had a more interest in some of the larger houses. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, who will talk to you about her favorite places in the book. And Heidi has to go after she leaves this.
Unfortunately, I have to leave after my presentation, so I want to thank you in advance for coming and being interested in the history of Evanston as we see it through its built environment. That was something that was extremely important to me, was how the built environment of Evanston embodies the history of what happened here. If you look around you and you start to do some research, you see buildings, places, gardens that show the history of how Evanston developed, and in many times the history of the nation as well. So the first one I'm going to show you, I'm going to show three. The first one is this little house, and it's often referred to in the vernacular as a Luxembourg house. It is on Wesley, which is on the other side of Ridge, on the west side of Ridge. And the reason I'm showing this very modest home is that the design of it was a typical vernacular house that was built in that area. Because on the opposite side of Ridge, that just as it does now, it slopes down, but it used to flood all the time. And people, in fact, got around by boat from time to time. And so I'm not sure you can see it that well, but the bottom story is built like a foundation wall to withstand flooding. So this little house was built in 1888. If you go by, it's at 1400 Wesley, I think is the address. And it's still standing there, and it shows something about the topography of Evanston that doesn't exist anymore. And the other thing that's interesting about it is the oral history of this house. It's over 120 years that the history of this house has been developing. And many people believed that animals and farm implements were kept on the lower floor and the people lived above, which is why the stairway was there. When the house was being renovated in 2012, they did research into it and discovered that was actually not true. The stair was not original, and so this is more what it looked like, and people lived on both floors. So that is kind of a capsule of what we came upon when we were researching many of these buildings. The histories are often conflicting, and you're not really sure exactly all the time what's true and what is a traditional or a folk history. And this little house right here embodies it very well. If you want to see an example that still has the exterior stair existing, there's one at 1501 Lake Street. So you could go by there and see that. But there it is, 1888, and it's still there. Okay, next slide, please, Jack. The next project I want to show you, or the next building I want to show you, is our post office. Once again, embodying the history of Evanston. I'm sure you all know that in 1929 there was a big stock market crash, and after that the country slipped into a huge depression, and nothing was going on. That's one of the decades where there are very few buildings. I mean, very little was going on. And Franklin Roosevelt tried to mitigate the economic suffering through his program, which was referred to as the New Deal. And this particular program built over 1,100 post offices all around the United States, and our post office is one of them. It's the main post office right here downtown on Davis. And the government singled out post offices to be built because they felt that that was something that signified government and good government and something that it did for the people. And also, most people go to the, in those days anyway, before the internet, go to the post office, you know, all the time. All classes of people, everybody goes there. So that's why they selected post offices. And the Public Works Administration report actually stressed, and I'm quoting here, the need for quality design. They said, we need design of an enduring character and lasting benefits. And I think our post office really embodies that. If you'll notice, it's big, it's strong, it has honed limestone. It looks very permanent and stable. And the government wanted to send a message to the people of America that the government was not going anywhere, that there was optimism for the future, the government policies and infrastructure would still be there. On the inside, as you can see on the right, it is a kind of a machine age design. It's honed metal, honed steel, very sharp edges, and it's really beautiful. It has a terrazzo floor with an inlaid design that's reflected in the ceiling. It has this rhythm of the repeated writing desks. It's really a very beautiful building, and I think sometimes we just forget about it. You know, we go in there and mail our letters and don't realize the history of it. The other part of this is, next slide, Jack, is we have two sets of paired sculptures at the library and at the post office. A lot of people think that the art produced during the New Deal was all from the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. That was only one program. They actually were several programs that produced art during this time, and we have two sculptures from that time. The Works Progress Administration gave artists a salary, and they were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted. Jackson Pollock was one of the artists who benefited from that program. The other program, which was called the Section of Painting and Sculpture, commissioned individual works of art, and so there was more control over those. And it's those pieces of artwork that we mostly think about as, you know, the New Deal or Depression era art. The images were very heroic. The people were kind of rounded forms. There was a stress for community and democracy and people working together, hard work. And these sculptures pretty much embody that. The first one on the left is called Throwing the Mail, and that's on the inside of the library. Those are there are two, excuse me? Post office. Oh, I always call it the library, sorry. Mail Handler and Throwing the Mail are the names of the two. Robert Russin was the artist, and those are cast aluminum figures covered with gold foil. And on the exterior of the post office are two other sculptures. One is called The Message, and the other is called The Answer by Armand Shaler. And these are limestone reliefs over the entry doors. And you can see by the forms that those were very typical of the kind of democratic ideals they were trying to represent at the time. As a little aside, I'm just going to say it's interesting to note that when Roosevelt started these programs, artists were not included. And they had the Army Corps of, the Civil Corps, the CCC, Conservation Corps, and things like that, and they did not have artists. And there was one artist named George Biddle, and he wrote to FDR, and he said, you know, artists are suffering too. Nobody's buying any artwork, nobody has any money, can you help us? So FDR began the Public Works of Art project, which then morphed into the WPA and the section of painting and sculpture. And artists in the program spoke that how much their morale was uplifted, and they finally felt that they were being acknowledged as important members of the American economic system, which I thought was interesting. And in the back of the book, we have an appendix which talks more about New Deal art. There's quite a bit more. In Evanston, it's mostly in public schools. So we have a little 2-page section in the back of the book that talks about that. Next slide, please. The last one I want to show you is an example of a Sears kit house. You're probably familiar with these. This also has history embedded in it, in that the Sears kit houses were produced between 1908 and 1940. There were something like 445 different designs, from the simplest cottage with no plumbing to big, 2-story, 5-bedroom homes made of brick, very nice. This is a sample page from a catalog. You could order your kit home. Everything was pre-cut, sent to the site, ready to be put with complete directions, not just the outside of the house, but wiring, plumbing, heating, hardware, everything. And this time period segues very perfectly with a big upsurge in Evanston's population. Between 1920 and 1930, according to census data, the population increased by 70%. And they were running out of land, so that's when Northwest Evanston began to be built. When the farms out there started to be subdivided, farmers began to sell their land. And so pretty much all the Sears kit homes, and there are about 30 in the city of Evanston, are in Northwest Evanston. And this is a good example. This is called the Osborne, and I love the way it's called, from the Golden West. I think this is it's sort of the arts and crafts sort of style that was developing in Pasadena and around, Southern California. Anyway, so far in Evanston, 6 of the kit homes have been absolutely positively verified, but there are, like I said, over 20 more, and they're not all Sears, but if you show me the next slide, and here it is. It's right there on Simpson Street, and you can walk by it. And also in the back of the book, we have an appendix that lists all the ones that have been identified as matching catalog models. So you can look at the addresses and go look at the houses. And if you go on Sears' website, they have an archive. If you just Google Sears Modern Homes Program, you can look up the catalog pages. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. I want to thank Jack Weiss not only for the wonderful building fragment, but also for the book. Actually, to the best of my knowledge, the idea was Jack's, and without Jack's effort and energy and perseverance, it just would not have happened. The reason that it's 150 entries, as most of you, I think, know, is that we are this year celebrating Evanston's 150-year anniversary as an incorporated town. As an introduction to the buildings that I would like to show you and to talk about, what I think we need to acknowledge is that at the end of the day, as ecumenical as we tried to be about this selection, what we all started with and to some extent ended with are our very favorite buildings. So if there's something that you think should be in the book, or if there's a building that you love that we've left out, I don't know what to say except you should do your own book. I went away to school, lived in Manhattan for a while, and when I came back to the Chicago area with 2 small girls, I decided I wanted to live in Evanston. I grew up in Winnetka, and all I knew about Evanston was this is where Northwestern University was, and Evanston Township High School was our football rivals. I chose Evanston in Southeast Evanston because it was just a fabulous, beautiful pedestrian walking community. The schools were good. It was a diverse community. I wanted my kids to grow up in something that resembled the real world a little bit more than Winnetka did. And I'm a residential architect. I do houses. And in my opinion, the houses in Southeast Evanston were just a phenomenal cross-section of architectural history. So the houses I want to show you tonight are all within walking distance of the houses and apartment buildings I want to show you tonight are all within walking distance of the apartment building that I live in. So the first house that I want to talk about on the left-hand side is the Elliott Anthony House. It was done by architects called Pond and Pond. They are very interesting architects. They were thought of as arts and crafts architects. Probably their most famous contribution to the city of Chicago is to have done all of the buildings that were part of the expansion and original complex of Hull House buildings, the Jane Addams settlement buildings. And in fact, one of the Pond brothers, Alan Pond, was involved with Hull House and was the recording secretary for many years of that organization. His brother was and their firm were very well known nationally, and in fact, Irving Pond was the president of the National American Institute of Architects. So the house was done for Elliott Anthony, who was a circuit court judge. Anthony was a book collector, and his first house, which was in the city of Chicago, burned down. It wasn't part of the Chicago fire, but when he decided to relocate to Evanston and build again, and I have no idea whether he lost his entire library or not, but the left-hand side, which is the west side of the house, is in fact a story and a half high, wonderful space, which is a library. So it only has, except for the bay that projects forward, high windows around the top, and it had an interior wrapper of bookcases that went all the way up to the sill of those clear-story windows. Interestingly enough, the house is brick, which then was, except for the interior woodwork, was thought to be fireproof construction. And the library itself was fitted with steel rolling shutters, which in case of a fire would have dropped and closed the library and its books off from the rest of the house. The style of the house is called Queen Anne, and Queen Anne was a combination of what architects like to refer to as vernacular forms and elements, highly picturesque, and classical elements. So if you look at the doorway, you can begin to see that. This house is at the corner of Michigan and Hamilton, and right across the street from it is another one of my absolute favorite houses in Evanston, and it's the Charles Jernigan house. Jernigan was a stockbroker, a member of the Chicago Stock Exchange, and the house was done by a guy called Enoch Turnock, Turnock had worked for William LeBaron Jenney, who is famous today as the father of the steel frame skyscraper, but Turnock only spent a short period of time in Chicago before he returned to his native home, which was Elkhart, Indiana, and he's probably his most famous or best known structure in Chicago is a thing called the Brewster. The Brewster is on Pine Grove and Diversey, and it's, I think, a 12 or 14-story amazing apartment building. The exterior is solid red granite blocks, and the interior has a light court that goes all the way up through the building. The entire light court is skylit. The elevators originally were open cage elevators that went up through the building. The stairs were completely open, and the catwalk around the atrium was made out of steel with glass blocks so that the light filtered through it. The entries to each of the apartments were off the catwalk, and the kitchens had windows into that space so that there was natural light coming from both sides. I think he was an absolutely extraordinary architect, and this house, I think, is probably the shingle style, which is what this house is an example of, is normally associated with the East Coast, but I think that this is an extraordinary example of that style, and what is sort of phenomenal to me is the way the porch wraps around, and then the whole second floor of the house is kind of subsumed into these undulating and pitched roof forms. And as you go around the corner, the north-facing facade is equally as extraordinary because the stair is expressed by huge windows that step up and follow the ascent of the stair. You want to do the next one? Sure. Okay. Okay. The next one is the Henry Swigert house on Sheridan Road. Swigert was a lumber baron, And as his architect, he hired Howard Van Doren Shaw. At the time, Shaw was probably the best-known residential architect in Chicago and one of the best-known residential architects in the country. No one had heard of Frank Lloyd Wright at that point in time, although he had done some houses and published some of his work. His work wasn't as lauded as it is today. Shaw's work, on the other hand, was published extensively, and he was the seventh person to receive the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, which is their highest award for design and architectural achievement, and he was only the third American at that point to receive that medal. Shaw's house is kind of interesting because you could just drive by it and think it's another brick house. What I find interesting here again is the kind of cottage or vernacular elements of the house, the double gable form, and then the kind of unusual skirt, and then if you look at the placement of the elements, the house starts off as something which is symmetrical about its center with the two gables, but then the classical entryway, which is almost like a collaged piece that's been brought to this house, is off-center. The windows are symmetrical if you look at the composition of the gables, and then you get this big long window that in a really surprising way cuts through the kind of tutu or ballet skirt that surrounds the bottom of this thing, and that's the stair landing, because the stair ascends immediately to one side of the entryway. So Shaw was kind of an extraordinary person. There are very few people outside of the Chicago area today who know who Shaw was. His houses were very quiet. They didn't do things to call attention to them, except the composition is kind of extraordinary, and the houses, because of that, have I think, idiosyncratic and very personal quality to them. Next slide. Okay. Again, just down the block from where I live, I think this is an extraordinary building. Most of the apartment buildings in Evanston and the North Side and in Hyde Park are courtyard buildings where you go in and then the entrances to the units and the stairs that serve the multifamily units are off the courtyard. This is exactly what this is, except it's really an amazing prototype for an urban building because the ground floor, like many urban apartment houses, is all shops. But look at what happens above the shop level. The entry to this building is on the side of the building. That's Main Street, and the side is Hinman. You went in an entryway into a lovely little wood-paneled kind of Tudor Revival lobby, and you went up a stair through a door, and you were outside again. You were in this courtyard, and you had to go through the courtyard to get to one of the stairs, and you can see the stairs because they're the section where you can see the one on the left and at the back of the courtyard. They're the section that pops forward, but you could walk around this arcade in case it was raining or snowing, which it seems to do a lot in Chicago, to get to your entryway. And then the whole courtyard, which is a kind of public space, is contained by the arcade, which you can see overlooking Main Street. So it's kind of an unusual building. I can't think of any others that are just like it. And it's on Main Street in Evanston. It's down the block from where I live. Could we have the next slide? This is around the corner from where I live, and it's just it's a Georgian revival in style, which is classical and simple classical elements in brick. And what I think is kind of amazing about it is, of all of the corner buildings, apartment buildings, it's actually entered diagonally from the corner, and I can't think of another building that actually uses the corner to make an automobile turnaround and formal drop-off spot. From that corner, you then go down a few steps into a sunken courtyard with a fountain in the center, and then there are three entrances. The entrances are like the one you can see in front of you. There's one to the right and one to the left, and they're recessed classical porticos, but the courtyard, unlike the outside of the building, has nearly it does have floor-to-ceiling glass, and it's amazing. It's almost like, I had a friend, actually a very famous architect, who used to describe their buildings as watermelons. And I said, you know, Malcolm, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, you know, a watermelon is a really cool fruit. It's green on the outside and hard, and you cut it open, and it's pink and soft, and it has black seeds on the inside. So here's this fairly solid building on the outside, and you walk into this courtyard, and it's all glass. It's just amazing. So people think of all glass buildings as being very contemporary, but in fact, here's a Georgian building that does exactly that. And it's around the corner from me, and it's one of my favorite apartment houses. And all of the houses and all of the things that I did in the book are buildings that I love and think are terrific and wanted to share with the readership of our book and all of you.
I just lost my brother-in-law. Don't take that wrong. You know, he walked out before I started speaking. Hi, I'm Chris Hartzell. I am on staff at the Evanston History Center. I am on the Preservation Commission. I'm vice chair of the Evanston Preservation Commission, and I'm a lifelong resident of Evanston. A lot of people ask me why I get involved in preservation, and I could say, well, first they tore my school down, Lincoln School on Main Street, and then they tore my church down, Second Presbyterian Church, which was a beautiful Prairie Gothic church, and I think that's what inspired me. This has been a wonderful project to be involved in. It's been a labor of love. We did argue a lot. Some people got buildings that I would have liked to have written, Stuart. And the joke was, though, what was my cutoff date? Because I'm a historian, and anything after 1935, I didn't weigh in on. I don't like any of it. So all the buildings that I will talk about today are earlier than that, I think. I start with University Hall on the campus, on Northwestern campus, as little as we Evanstonians like to concede that there was no town of Evanston until Northwestern arrived and founded it. This was the first really architecturally significant building that was built in Evanston. It was built on the campus. It was the first one they did. And it set the tone for Evanston. Most universities, when they choose an architectural style, will either go federal or Gothic, because Northwestern was founded by Methodists who were founding a university based on their beliefs. They chose Gothic because that's the religious reference. So that sort of set the tone for early architecture in Evanston. It was built in 1869, and the architect was Gurdon Randall, who was very well known at the time in the area. So that's one of my favorite buildings. I realized the first time I did a presentation here that I didn't represent for Daniel Burnham, who was an Evanston resident and a big name architect, as we all know, and lived in Evanston for many, many years and built here. Burnham and Root did the Emmanuel Methodist Church, which is on Oak and Greenwood. It's a beautiful red sandstone church, sandstone from Lake Superior. It used to have a very tall peaked tower that was hit by lightning and burned. So if you can envision an even taller tower over the steeple there on the left, it's unusual that they placed the steeple at the back. Some people may question whether Burnham was an architect or a good businessman, but Root, certainly no one will argue. John Root was a very talented architect, and he's credited with this building, probably more so than Burnham. The interior is very simple, very prairie. It presaged the prairie look, and it had the peaked roof was translucent glass, so that it just flooded the sanctuary with light. I don't believe it's like that anymore. And on the right is First Presbyterian Church. That's the third building that stood on that site, and that was Daniel Burnham, 1894. So, and he just lived a few blocks east of there on Dempster Street. Next, Jack. Yes, I forgot what I had in here. It's been a few months since we gave this presentation. Robert Spencer. We used to call these the doll houses. I don't know if anybody in Evanston has ever referenced them. They're on Lincoln and Pioneer. Robert Spencer was one of the first 4 in Steinway Hall with Frank Lloyd Wright and Robert Spencer and Dwight Perkins, another Evanston resident, and then my favorite, Myron Hunt, and don't worry, we'll hear about him in a little bit. Spencer did these 3 buildings. It was an interesting example of suburban architecture evolving. You were getting smaller lots, you were infilling, and he had an awkwardly shaped lot here, and he managed to fit these 3 houses, each having private gardens and each having access to the driveway, or excuse me, the alley. They all have the same floor plan, basically. The center one is very prairie looking, very early prairie. We're looking at 1895 here, but it's got the low hipped roof and the high trim around under the bottom of the second story windows, but the 2 on the end have very high peaked roofs. The center one was actually chosen rather immediately as an example for the Cranford Doll House series, which was featured in House Beautiful, and the other of the original 4, one of the others was Mount Vernon. So that gives you an example of the the respect that was had for this design. It was very modern design. Next, Jay. Myron. I just went back to school to get my master's. I was what we call a non-traditional student, in case anybody wants to know what you call people my age who are in school. I just finished my thesis on Myron. He's an Evanston architect. He was one of the original 4 with, as they say, Robert Spencer and Dwight Perkins and that guy from Oak Park that everybody makes a big deal about. And everybody when you say Prairie, you say Frank Lloyd Wright. You go to Oak Park to look at Prairie. And I think in Evanston we have a fine example of Prairie School, and Myron was right there at the beginning. He lived in Evanston from 1895 until 1903 when he moved to Pasadena, California, because his wife had tuberculosis, and he went on to create the Rose Bowl, the Huntington Library, many, many famous things. But he started his career in Evanston. There are over 30 houses left in Evanston that he did. Stuart talked about the shingle style, which was coming off of the Queen Anne, another Evanston architect that I like, Thomas Talmadge. I don't think we're showing any of his stuff today, are we? He's very quotable. He designed our street lights, if you're familiar with our street lights with the water, the waves on the bottom and the oak leaves at the top. He said of the Queen Anne style, one looks in vain to find any part of the house not writhing in architectural agony. The Prairie School and the shingle style took that and refined it. They called it disciplining the picturesque. It's a great term that I like to use. And Myron was right there on the cusp. And he took the shingle style, he modified it, he modernized it. He's got his house that he built for himself was at 1627 Wesley. It's still there, and also the one that most people recognize, which is on the corner of Dempster and Ridge, the Catherine White House. It's a double house. The floor plan is very similar to his own house. It's very similar in style to his house. A lot of people will have said Frank Lloyd Wright had some credit for it, or even Megan E. Griffin did, but it's all Hunt, and he's deserving of higher profile, I think. Do I have any more? Yes, just the Walter Burley Griffin coming along later when the Prairie School was actually starting to establish itself. This is on Judson. Was done for Elsie Carter and her husband Frederick. And Elsie was the cousin of Chancellor Livingston Jenks, if you know Chancellor Street and Livingston Street and Jenks Street. Who also was an early client of Myron Hunt's, but Myron was already in Pasadena by then. So this is Griffin style. Each of the Prairie School architects really had sort of a signature look, and Griffin had this giant front gable that you see, and the mullions, the dividers in his windows were always this wide wood strip. This picture I actually don't like because you can't see that long lateral dining room on the end, but what Prairie School did was, as we said, bring everything down. Victorian was high and narrow, Prairie School was low and wide, and they would establish the horizontality by putting porches on the sides, by using those banded strips of wood. And in my classes, if I had a nickel for every time they started talking about Prairie School and put up the Frederick Carter house, and every time I would say, and by the way, you know that house is in Evanston. So part of my efforts in this was as a hometown gal, is to get the wider world to recognize what not only Prairie School, but just overall wonderful architecture we have in Evanston. Thanks.
If I could just add to that just a second. Chris and I had the same issue with Evanston versus Oak Park. Oak Park has a one-tune story to tell, and we have a symphony.
That's good. I like that. Hi, I'm Laura Saviano. I work with Ross Barney Architects, and my company has designed a couple of buildings in town, but I've lived in Evanston for now going on 20 years, and I've always just been enamored with the place that it is, as all of us were. And the backstory to this was that we actually presented this project to the Evanston 150 Foundation as one of their 150 things to do in celebration. They turned us down, so we did this anyway, and it truly was a labor of love. Thank you to Jack Weiss, because this, if it weren't for Jack, this would not have happened. So we came up with this idea that we would take a snapshot in the year 2013. Well, when we started, it was what? What year did we start? 11? Oh my gosh. 2011, to take a snapshot of where architecture was. And it was difficult to narrow it down. And so in that regard, we came up with a couple of appendices in the back of the book. Heidi spoke of one earlier about the WPA, but I did some research on the shopping and cultural districts because I was fascinated by this idea of transit-oriented development way back in the day. Evanston, you could say, probably invented it. We have several shopping districts and areas that are centered around rapid transit, starting at not so much South Boulevard, but most definitely Main Streets, Dempster Street, Noyes, Foster, downtown. So along the rapid transit lines, we have these very vibrant cultural districts that have been there, and they continue to this day. And that's really exciting. What are some of our other appendices in the back, Jack? They're parks, right? Open spaces, WPA, and then the one that you wrote was cultural. It talks about all the amazing grace.
Oh,
You're going to talk about that.
Landmarks.
You're going to talk about that one. Okay. Oh, okay.
Landmarks.
Cultural
Amazing
landmarks.
Grace, which was one of the first coffee houses ever.
So if you haven't, if you haven't read the book, just pick it up and thumb through it. It's fascinating, and it's worth it. If any of you live here or love the community, it's worth the $15.
Also, just to add on to that, you said it before too. We ended up with 150 places, but we had a lot more things we wanted to talk about, and so parks became a story in itself, and these shopping districts became a story in itself, and WPA became a story.
So all of these things contribute to make up this unique place that we know and love called Evanston. And Burnham, actually, I wanted to quote Burnham, and I think I have the wrong quote because it's stated on the back of the book. He said, "Evanston is the most beautiful suburb in the world." City. It's city. Okay, thank you. I had it wrong. So he probably didn't even know what a suburb was, right? So my favorite places and spaces tended to be in the public realm, because that's what my firm concentrates on, and we had so much fun, didn't we? We'd get together for these book meetings and we'd discuss and argue a little bit, and while everyone had their favorite houses, I had my favorite, public buildings. So my research, I found that where old met new was, I think you can forward here, Jack. What's my next? Where old met new was fascinating to me. And so what I found interesting was that the Emerson Y, really what this building, this place meant to people as a center of African American life for more than 50 years in this community, I felt was just paramount. We had to include this building. The normal Y was segregated like many buildings in the 20th century. Blacks here in Evanston were forbidden to join the Y. So 1914, business leaders got together, raised the money, and created this building, which is now gone. But it meant so much to people in this community that there was actually a book written about it, documentary film made, and exhibits that celebrated its history. And such an inspiring story. There were some great, if you Google New York Times and Emerson Y, alderman, and I'm blanking on her name, was interviewed. You know, which alderman is in this? Dolores, thank you. There's a fabulous New York Times article about this building, and it's just very, very inspiring. So take a look at that. The Chandler's building was one of the other buildings that I selected and researched. I thought it was...
I'm stuck.
You're stuck. You just need to go escape, probably. Where are you? There you go. Now you should be able to move forward.
Okay.
The Chandler's building. I found it fascinating because I absolutely loved what happened to this building in 1999 when Halliburton Root renovated the original building. There were 3 buildings originally on this property. Originally, the Chandler's building, Chandler's store, was a catch-all store that included the Northwestern Bookstore. And through my research, I found out that they sold Crossley cars from a catalog from the store. So they'd have one of these cars in front of the store on a Saturday where you could actually go and kick the tires and open the doors. And if you wanted to order it through their catalog, they would do that for you. I thought that was so cool. John Malkovich, the actor, worked here. But what I thought was great was that when they renovated the building, they couldn't make the floors line up, so they actually demolished one that was right on the corner and created a plaza, an open plaza that is such a nice relief in counterpoint to Fountain Square, which is directly kitty corner from that. So it's not often that developers do that when they work on buildings. So it was really a nice gift to the city. New buildings. I just have been enamored with many of the new buildings that were included in the book. Are Design Evanston Award winners. Among them are fire stations, synagogues, live and work spaces that have been renovated from other previous existing buildings. And what sets them apart, in my mind, is their really inventive use of materials, and some materials that have been reused and recycled. And for me, these are setting, the example for future generations when they look back 50 years from now saying, those are good buildings, and thank you for leaving those behind. So among these are very sustainable buildings. We have, if any of you are familiar with LEED Gold, LEED Platinum, probably LEED Silver, I'm sure. I think we probably have one example of every one of them in Evanston. But this is the Clark Street Beach House done by David Woodhouse Architects in 2010. The use of durable and reused materials in this building, I loved it. I loved it from the beginning. He actually reused the Lannon stone, which is the white stone you see in the building, from the original comfort station that was located on Ridge, just about maybe 100 yards from this new facility. So I thought that was a really important building to include in our book. So in my mind, all of these buildings contribute to this wonderful city that we all know and love. And again, want to thank Jack for his enduring passion to bring this book for all of us for the future. Thanks.
Now it's my turn. We do this alphabetically. I have 4 faves that I called them. And I think my faves represent the full cross-section of housing types and scales in our community. This is the Warren House on Sheridan Place in the very northeast corner of our city, 1912 by Zimmerman. We have a number of other Zimmerman homes in the book too, but this is unique because it's massive, one of the largest houses in our town. And its coach house is as big as most big houses are in this town. The coach house is to the north of this building. From that to the Thayer cottages, I've always been fascinated by these little, pokey little houses on the east end of Thayer near Prairie. Heidi lives up near there, so she walks by these all the time. I have to drive myself by them frequently because I love them so much. There are probably 6 or 8 of them in a row, and actually there are other ones on Isabella on the next block north, the same quadrant, actually immediately north of there on Isabella. There are more of these little frame cottages. We think they may have been summer cottages, but I don't think we have the history on that. And some have been, I use the term upped. They've had second stories added to them, which makes them god-awful. I was responsible for creating the Oakton Historic District some years ago. I lived over there at the time. This is on Harvard Terrace. One of the more unique craftsman houses, bungalows in that community, because it has the, sort of a California style look. The Oakton Historic District is from Ridge to Asbury on the west, Oakton on the north to roughly Howard on the south. Oakton School is a landmark building in that district, and it's a Perkins and Will building, and has a lot of public art in it, a lot of serious public art. But the whole community is built of these 1920s, what am I trying to say? They are bungalows. The bungalow belt in Chicago was roughly Western Avenue, and so that was the development in the 20s at the time in Chicago, and those bungalows just kept on coming north and swung right through South Evanston. Western Avenue is Asbury, right? Or is, yeah. And then last but not least, another group of little tiny brick bungalows on Ridgeway, north of Grant, north of Presbyterian Homes. These were built in 26, so roughly during the building boom of the 20s that Heidi spoke about earlier. A lot of bungalows in those days. Those cottages were earlier in the 1920s, but that is the Thayer cottages. But these bungalows were all in the 20s. And these little guys had 2 or 3 bedrooms. If you drive by there, you can't believe how many rooms they packed into these little guys. Those are my favorites, from the very big Warren house to the very little Thayer cottages and Ridgeway bungalows. I think that wraps up our story. Yes, it does. So this ran exactly 1 hour, which is what we had designed it for. Would be happy to take questions and answer your questions.
Thank you all so much for coming and being interested in this project.
If there are no other questions, then thank you for, yes?
I don't have a question. Well, I do have questions, but I didn't bring my notebook, so I can't remember them. There were a lot of questions about houses I know, but I never noticed certain details before. But this really made me appreciate, I mean, I love this town. I've lived here since '61. And I love walking around it, and I've always I like to peek in the houses at night. I love it. But to realize, seeing the names of all these architects in one presentation really blew my mind, because I know about this one and this one, but to see them all as a conglomeration of great talent and great regard for dwellings and other uses besides dwellings. It's just wonderful. I thank you. And I wish we could go on tours to some of these places.
Well, we often have tours. Design Evanston does conduct tours throughout the year. So if you have some ideas, we're certainly open to listen to your suggestions. We'd love to.
Yes.
I just wonder, you of course haven't included any of the optimum buildings. I mean, we're talking about old Evanston. Yeah, you would.
No, but we do have, I think we have, of all the architects, maybe more of Optima's buildings than any other architect. We've got 4 of his buildings that span a fairly long period of time. The earliest one is down by where we live at Michigan and Maine. They're townhouse design. And the most recent one, of course, is here with the one on, what's it called? The one on Emerson, Clark Emerson, whatever that street is called. Has 3 names, I think. Yeah. That's not in our book, but.
In response to the question about house tours, Chris didn't say it, but the Evanston History Museum does on Mother's Day a house tour, and they get into some really wonderful houses. The tour this year had a number of houses by, oh my God.
We had the Frederick Carter house on, and we had David Cade's very modern little
and Mayo,
glass house.
and 2 Mayo houses. Mayo did 38 houses in Evanston. They were wonderfully talented architects, almost as good as Myron Pond.
Right, absolutely. And I give walking tours from the History Center the 1st and 3rd Saturdays. And
you do?
Yeah, so we don't go in the houses, but we go by and we talk about it. So absolutely, look us up at the website.
Great. I was wondering, if you ever thought about doing one in the winter, say during the holidays, that would...
You know, that's some,
Really
many
nice.
people have asked me, and as an architectural photographer, I can tell you, you can't see a house unless the leaves are off the trees very well, right? So, and we've never have done that. I do them June to October, but I've had a number of people ask lately, so I think I will. It's risky business. I don't want to be slipping on the ice, and I don't, you never know what the weather's going to be like, but maybe we could do like an impromptu or plan it and see how the weather turns out.
But Chris, you were planning the upstairs, downstairs kind of?
Yeah, we
tour?
did that.
Downstairs, whatever it was.
Yes.
Title. Are you going to do that again?
Yes, we are.
Okay,
Yeah,
good.
that's
You're
in
doing
the
it
Dawes
again?
house. We did our
Back.
Downton Abbey
Yes.
rip off of front stairs, back stairs. We're calling it.
It was a great
yeah,
tour.
very fun. It was
That's one
fun.
of the participants, I can
Yeah.
think. Yes.
That Excel spreadsheet is exciting, and I wonder if you have if you can sell that, or I mean, because I don't think this is produced in iBook form yet.
We're considering it.
Oh, well, that would be great.
Yeah.
But it would really be nice to be able to have that Excel spreadsheet. So I'll just ping you on that. And the other is, can we?
And you can play with it and sort it the way you want to sort it. Yeah.
But the one of the final book and not all the like 350 that we actually.
The iterations
No,
are
the-
fascinating.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is, I'm really glad to hear that there'll be a second edition, because I couldn't get my hands on a hardcover edition. It was gone by the
We
time.
only printed, the first run was, we printed 350 softbounds and 35 hardbounds. But the 35 hardbounds were gone the night that we had our first book
Yeah.
launch. So we're currently at the printer, we're printing 100 hardbounds and 500 softbounds.
We
The
just
good
had
news
no
was-
idea what the demand for the book
Exactly.
was.
Right.
One of the nice things about the second edition, we made just some minor corrections, nothing really major, it's the same book basically. But we're getting it at a much lower cost. So now we can go to bookstores to sell it at their discounted rate. And we'll be in bookstores now. Otherwise, we've been tied to First Bank and the City Clerk and the
Yeah.
History Center, because we're selling it at cost at this point.
So my
The good
question-
news about selling at bookstores,
Yes.
the first one to go for it was the CAF bookstore, Chicago Architecture Foundation. So now we're going to be head to head with Oak Park in the CAF bookstore.
So is it possible to sign up in advance to
Sure,
get a
absolutely.
hardcover
Sure.
copy? I'd like to reserve one, so,
Yeah, absolutely.
oh, great, okay. Great.
Any other questions? Yes?
Well, I sort of just more had a comment than a question. I actually love this book and I love the presentation. I was born here in Evanston, so a lot of the stuff is very familiar to me. And I remember walking past some of these places when I was a little girl. But my question is, well, first I want to say I appreciate all the time that you put into this book, but I want you guys to write a second book, because there's so many places that need to be in here, and this lady here, knowing all the history and she knowing some of the business things with the transit, the cultural centers and the shopping centers, I want to know about Weebles and and Littons and Betty's of Winnetka and Dransons. I mean, you know, just so many things.
There's a website.
Yes.
There's a website called Forgotten Chicago. I think
Yeah.
it's ForgottenChicago.org. We just had a downtown tour 2 weeks ago, and we looked at, we talked about the old Weebles, the old Marshall Fields. You know where the little, what's it called, the little restaurant on the southwest corner of the field?
Yeah, it used to be a gas station.
It was a gas
What's
station
Low Keep
down
now?
there.
That was a gas station.
And we actually walked quite a good distance, including walking past the Tinker Toy store, Tinker Toy factory, which they didn't know about, and I had to point out to them, that's where Tinker Toys were made.
Clark Candy Factory, how about that?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
yeah, so
We have-
you could do everything.
you're gonna be on the
I've already had 2 phone
Evanston is wonderful, so I'm so happy. you
I've
did.
had 2 phone calls already with people nominating their homes for our next book.
I wasn't gonna say that yet.
Yes.
There's a what is it, Shared Streets event over Labor Day weekend, September 1st, and they are going to be having a walking tour on that, and I put it together. I'm going to get my daughter's wedding that day, so I can't give the tour, but I put a lot of Lost Evanston on that as well. Laredo Taft, the sculptor, used to live at 1326 Chicago. I didn't know that. Yeah. All kinds of stuff that's been gone, the Tinker Toys, and so you might, you have time. It's at Dexter and Chicago Avenue on Sunday, September 1st. It's an Evanston 150 event.
The street's closed.
Called
It's
Shared
open.
Streets, I think, or something. Yeah,
Street
they're
closed
gonna
for
shut
2 or 3
down
blocks.
streets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we're interested, we can find this info on the city's
I
website?
believe so, actually.
Or Evanston now, isn't, no, that's still about.
Evanston, www.evanston150.org, right?
Yes.
Where was the Tinker Toy Factory?
Greenwood and the,
Sherman.
what's Custer or Sherman,
It's-
right? Just on the west
Just
edge.
west of the tracks.
Sherman splits at that point, so there's Sherman Court east of the tracks and Sherman Avenue flips to the west side. So it's the corner of Greenwood and Sherman, and there's a company called Leapfrog on the Line
Yes.
now in that building. And in fact, the way we know it was the Tinker Toy, found out it was the Tinker Toy Factory is, I am, who else was with me?
I think it was me,
Yeah, we were at the, what's it called? The
Community Foundation, was it?
No,
was
it was
If
something
you
on
come to the
Northwestern
History Center, you can
campus.
find it.
Oh, it's the
Mashup, the
mashup.
Evanston
Mashup.
Mashup. Laura and I were talking to this guy who is the president of Leapfrog Online, telling him about the work, and he said, well, did you know that our building was where Tinker Toys were invented and manufactured? So that's in the cultural section of the book now.
Any other questions? Feel free to nominate your homes.
More public spaces and
Send the
buildings.
nominations to Jack.
Did anybody ever mention the Greenleaf houses with the gingerbread?
I talk about them on my tours.
Oh, okay, I lived in one of those.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, and I
No, I
know
love
they're
them.
sprinkled around, yeah.
Those are the very simple, early Gothic Italian cottages that Luther Greenleaf built. He lived in a very elaborate one, but they're simple front gable. And once you know them, you spot them all over town. It's kind of a game, right? Oh, there's another one.
Yes.
What's that long house on the corner of Dempster and Ridge on the east side?
Chris showed that
Oh,
on
I
this
got
side.
it.
That's the
Oh,
Catherine
right.
White House at Howard,
Hunt.
Myron Hunt.
Myron Hunt, he was a early prairie school, very early, and that's like, it's my mission in life to elbow Frank Lloyd Wright aside and have him get Myron.
So was that originally built for 2 or 3 families?
Yes, it's a double house.
Two
It was built for 2 families. I just finished my thesis on him, so I know more than I'm sure anybody wants to hear about everything, but Catherine White was actually Harvey Hurd's sister-in-law, and both that she was in this, her family roots in Evanston went way, way back, and she had lived, you know, the Lore Mansion, where the little houses have been, that was the White House for 30 or 40 years, and then when her husband died, she built this double house for herself and her niece. And then,
Was that vacant for many years? Many times I would drive by, it looked like nobody was living in it.
yeah, you know, yeah, I don't know, it has changed hands.
Currently has one owner.
No, I think one side of it was
Was
vacant
empty
for a while because it was on the market for a lot of money and it didn't sell immediately. The thing that Chris mentioned is that it's such a good building that people have surmised that Frank Lloyd Wright had something to do with it. And the reason for that is, as Chris pointed out, in Steinway Hall, which was done for the Steinway Piano Company and had their showrooms on the ground 2 floors and then office space above, the designer of the building, Dwight Perkins, had a studio in the attic space, basically, big open skylit space. And because it was more space than he could afford, he asked his friends, Frank Lloyd Wright, Robert Spencer, who else was in there?
Oh, some guy named Myron Hunt.
And Myron Hunt to help share the rent, and they all paid for a secretary. And when one person didn't have work, they helped make drawings for somebody who did. So in a way, there was a kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, and people worked on other people's projects. And to that end, Robert Spencer, 5 or 6 years before Wright did the first Prairie House, published a cross-shaped plan that had porches extending the living space at the ends of 3 of the 4 wings of the cross in House Beautiful, and it was called Concrete House for $5,000 or something like that. But it was probably the source of the whole period of architectural development that Frank Lloyd Wright did. And of course, Frank Lloyd Wright was a genius, so he didn't need to credit anybody else that contributed ideas to his work.
You know my favorite quote about, who was
Oh,
it?
yeah. Why don't you
Sarah
tell me?
Miss that said, "I've just met with Frank Wright and he was neither." Isn't that great?
You're writing a book.
I am.
Write a Myron Hunt book.
Are you? I'm speaking with some people. I am.
I actually studied architecture with an amazing guy who was trained as an architect, but is remembered today as a teacher and theoretician and architectural critic. He was an Englishman named Colin Rowe. And he actually disliked Wright's work. And he, at one point, said that he thought Wright was a genius with no taste. And then he said, but of course one prefers Mozart to Chopin.
Good, interesting. I prefer Chopin myself.
Do you? You don't find it kind of over elaborated and, you know?
That's not our area.
I think that's what it is. Right, just too, you know.
So as we ourselves now roam the Evanston streets, we are also seeing places that we forgot.
Oh,
Places
yeah,
that we left out of the
absolutely.
book.
I wish we could have
So
put
we're
something
starting our
in.
own little.
We're
list.
gonna do the 2nd edition.
Also,
We have a first committee.
Yeah. Isn't that awesome? I'll buy it.
Well, how about
Part 2.
Well, it could be also in the Salon de Refuses, which was the art exhibit that all the Impressionists had because they weren't allowed into
There you go.
The
real thing, the academic one.
As we always say, I mean, we had to do 150. I mean, that was the premise, right? And it was a struggle. It was a struggle, and it changed that Excel spreadsheet. I didn't even look at it anymore. I just
Really?
tell me what the 30 are that I'm doing.
Really,
I can't
really,
read this
really.
sheet
We have
anymore.
people saying, we can't do a book that's all houses. There are too many
That was
houses
for
in here.
us.
And then some of the rest of us said, yes, but it's, except for
Residential
Northwestern
community.
University, it's all houses, isn't it?
Exactly.
I have a question about the lakefront bike and walking path. I think it's magnificent. And who did it, and whose vision was it? What did it cost?
The walking path?
So you mean the new path? It's only
Yeah.
like 2 years old.
It's
Yeah.
newly, well, you know,
Yeah.
parts of it I think were there, right? But it's newly lighted and.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the city did the lighting.
They did a
That should
master
be
plan.
that should be a Design Evanston award.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, Ben Halsell, who was the head of Streets and Sand in 1900, I really credit for creating our lakefront because he kept dumping street sweepings into the lake. In fact, I just recently read this great article, letter, the local neighbors were complaining that he was dumping trash in the lake, but his idea was to build up that lakefront park, which was a pretty narrow strip of land for a long time, and until they put that revetment in, it would get washed out every few years when a big lake storm would come in. I tried to find the origin of the lagoon and just could not. It just seemed to be, it was his idea. This guy took his initiative and did it, and he said, and there was this great thing that said, and in 100 years, Evanstonians will have this lovely gem on the lakefront, and we do.
Yeah, no, I was going to add that architects' legacies are a kind of interesting thing. Walter Nash, who did some of my least favorite buildings in the Northwestern campus, was for a brief time commissioner of parks, and he was actually drummed out of the office for proposing the narrowing of the lanes on Lakeshore Drive to create a landscape median down the center.
I love it. Yeah.
There was originally this kind of hydraulic system that allowed the lanes to be shifted to have more going in one direction. At rush hour, and Netch thought that since they didn't work anymore anyway, that it was a bad idea and that we should actually landscape Lakeshore Drive. And everybody thought that was a terrible idea. He was forced out of that position. And now the landscaping is there. And it's one of the most beautiful things about driving to and from the city, from Evanston.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think we've run our course. Thank you all for coming.